All right, guys, Louis here, and today we have another interview. So, if you're trying to learn a language and specifically vocabulary, which in my opinion and in my experience, this is the most problematic and probably the most important aspect of language learning, then you definitely need to listen to this interview because today I have with me Dr. Joe Barcroft, who's a specialist in this field of vocabulary, a professor and researcher. So I'm going to be asking a bunch of questions with really the goal here is for the listeners to understand, how can I go about better learning how can I learn a language in a way that is more effective and efficient? So, Joe, I'm going to let you introduce yourself and at the same time answer the question of why is it that people should listen to your advice?
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here and to speak with you. I'm Joe Barcroft. I am a professor of Spanish and second language acquisition, and also an affiliate professor of psychological and brain sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. And I specialize in research on second language acquisition and the pedagogical implications thereof, with a particular focus on vocabulary. And I think, as a general answer to your question about why this can be informative to both language instructors and language learners, is that I think we have a basic choice, which is whether to base our learning and our teaching on evidence-based practices, on evidence that we have, on theoretical advances that have strong support, or we can do a bit of a guessing game and a bit of a wishful thinking. So I certainly think that the former is the way to go.
Nice. Um, so we're going to start with obviously this interview is going to be centered on vocabulary because this is your area of interest, and I do think that this is the most important area for most language learners. There's so much vocabulary to learn to be functional in the language. The first question I have, and by the way, I thank you for sending me your the questions that you suggested. But in my experience, my approach for a long time now has been for a language like Japanese, for example, that I'm learning. There are thousands of words or word families that I need to know. And so my approach has been, okay, if I want to be fluent in a certain number of months or a certain number of years, then I need to know X, word families. So I think I talked about this with Paul Nation, where if you want to be able to understand movies at about the 98% level, then you need to know about the 5,000 most common lemmas or word families. And so I make flashcard packages with thousands of words. I know this is a popular approach. And then I say, okay, if I learn the first 5,000 here, then, I'm going to be in a good place. Of course, it's not exactly right because we're talking about words, whereas you need to know word families. And my question is, if I learn these 5,000 words, can I really consider them as known? So the more general question is, what does it mean to know vocabulary?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question. And first of all, I'd just like to say that I absolutely agree with you with the central importance of vocabulary in language acquisition in general and in second language acquisition in particular, which we're focusing on here. And I'd also like to comment before I want to address the issue of what it means to know vocabulary and all different types of vocabulary. Um, but I think I'll start off with what you mentioned about the idea of learning the 5,000 most frequent lemmas in Japanese, which I think would be great, and good luck doing that.
Yeah.
Um, if you're learning these as isolated lexical items, that will provide you with one type of knowledge, but the extent to which it will extend to other your ability to use that vocabulary in context and to know all of the aspects that's involved in learning individual words and other types of lexical items. That's more questionable, right? So, in general terms, I would advocate both, that you can learn isolated items, but that certainly is not a replacement for the kind of learning that you need to do in context, right? So I wrote a chapter in a recent volume that focused on vocabulary, and we can distinguish between actually two different continua of types of learning of vocabulary. One would be the distinction between purely incidental vocabulary learning and purely intentional. So intentional would be when you, like as you mentioned, you have lists of words. You're trying on purpose to learn all of these words. And intentional would be, and incidental would be when you pick up words from context, either during reading, during conversations, and so forth, without really intending to do so. And I'm not the only researcher in the field that would argue that actually there's a continuum between those two extremes, right? And there are advantages and disadvantages to each end, I think, of that particular continuum. One of the advantages of the intentional side is that you're planning for vocabulary learning. You can control what you're doing. You can use frequency dictionaries to determine your target vocabulary. So as you mentioned, so you can reach different thresholds for different levels of coverage that you want. That's nice. But the advantage of the incidental side of learning things more in context, let's say, and without intention, is you're going to have maybe perhaps more fluent use of those words, and you're going to have knowledge that that you're going to need for fluent use, production of the words in conversations, and so forth. And then another continuum that we can point to would be a continuum between when you learn words in an isolated fashion versus in an integrated fashion. So I think that's another continuum that we can point to. And again, both extremes of that continuum, I think, also have their advantages and disadvantages, right? So when it comes to learning second language vocabulary, in addition to learning individual word forms, their meanings, the mapping between word forms and their meanings, we also be learning a lot of different types of vocabulary. And we will be learning, individual words, lexical phrases. We need to learn the collocational properties of words, which refers to other words that co-occur with individual words. For example, we would say, this color is baby blue. We would not say this is infant blue, for example. That would sound odd to fluent speakers of English. So we need to learn all of those different types of lexical items, and we need to be able to learn all of that knowledge. We need to go beyond learning words as just isolated lexical items, because how do you get information about the collocational properties of words? You need to either see them or hear them or both in sentences, and you need to and discourse level input and so forth, so that you gradually over time develop all of these word specific types of knowledge. And when you have a first language, you might make assumptions about how a word can be used in terms of its collocational properties, also in terms of its syntactic projections, the syntactic projections that we associate with different types of words. So, for example, if we have the word put, you have to put something somewhere. It's a projection that you need to learn. All of that type of knowledge, when you're learning your 5,000 most frequent words in Japanese, you may not be able to, well, you're likely not going to be able to get that type of knowledge just relying on learning isolated lexical items alone. So I think both learning in isolation and learning in context, right, through immersion, have their advantages.
Right. So, and just to clarify for the listeners, when we're talking about intentional learning, it's really when you do activities where the main goal is to acquire vocabulary, and then incidental is, the learning of vocabulary is a byproduct of the activity. So, I'm assuming that incidental vocabulary learning would be mainly activities input, I suppose, reading and listening. Does this include anything else?
Yeah. Well, first of all, my my research focuses mainly on what I would call lexical input processing. So we could talk. I think everything starts with the input, be it intentional or incidental. But could you say your question again? I'm sorry
Yeah, I was
about.
saying that in the and sorry about the roosters. I mean, it's
Oh
crazy
no.
here in Tahiti. But yeah, so the incidental learning, as far as vocabulary,
Yes.
this is mainly reading and listening, right? There's nothing else really.
Well, I would say reading, listening, and all types of communication, right? When you're
Right.
engaged in different types of communicative acts. So, communication is negotiation of meaning, and vocabulary and other types of language learning are going to, vocabulary learning and other types of language learning are going to occur in those situations.
Okay. Right.
When it's an incidental content, and I agree with your definitions of incidental versus intentional. But I also think that it is actually a continuum. So, for example, if
Uh-huh.
I said, "Here, read this novel by Stephen King," right? And but also try to learn all the new words in each chapter. So, and I'm going to test you on the on the I'm going to test you on the content of the of the book, and I'm going to ask your opinion about the book, for example. Well, just by the fact that I said, "Oh, and try to learn these words," I've given you a certain amount of intentionality or pointed you toward a certain amount of intentionality. If I said also, you're going to be tested on those words as well, any new word in that book, you might even spend more time intentionally focusing on those words. So I think it's actually a continuum between what we can consider fully intentional and fully incidental. And, even with first language acquisition, uh, typically we think, well, almost all vocabulary learning in first language is incidental, at least until we become fluent in the language. We tend to think that. But of course, there are times when you're studying for tests, the GRE, whatever test you might study, you intentionally study as well. And even as children learning their first language, sometimes, children will point to things and we'll play the name game and we're just going to name things in the room. Well, if the child is old enough and, is kind of knows what they're doing, they may be doing a type of intentional vocabulary learning, saying, I want to know the names for these things. So I think there's really a continuum between what we can consider to be wholly intentional and wholly incidental. And I think what you were talking about when you were talking about your list, correct me if I'm wrong, or the extent to which I'm wrong, was focusing largely on intentional
Right.
vocabulary learning,
Yes.
right? Okay. Yeah. So just recognizing the limits of that and the types of knowledge that you simply won't be able to gain from that without having sentence level, at least input in both well, it could be in written form, it could be in spoken form, but you can't get knowledge collocational properties when you're not exposed to them. You can't really have any type of knowledge until you're exposed to that type of information or
Uh-huh.
data in the input.
Right. So the specific flashcards I'm referring to is, I'm sure some listeners are familiar with it. I developed a product called the Anki Core Decks, which is it's just flashcard packages that are compatible with Anki, the free piece of software, which is pretty popular. And so the flashcards each have a target word, and this is very much based on the frequency list that I built based on corpora in multiple languages. And so each flashcard has a target word in the language plus an example sentence. So I suppose there is some degree of context, but at the same time, it's probably not quite enough to understand all the collocations of this word and so on. Um, I just want to ask a question that sometimes I receive in the comments on YouTube, which is that, why can't I just, if I want to learn vocabulary, if I want to learn a language, why can't I just do incidental learning in the sense, just do input, listening and tons of reading? Why do I have to bother with boring flashcards and, boring word lists? Is this even necessary?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. Well, so let's. A lot of times, I like to start with the idea of first language acquisition, right? And so, just let me ask you this question to follow up as a first, question.
Uh-huh.
Um, was it necessary? in your first language? Was it necessary?
No.
Not really, right? However, it could have some advantages if you had done that, right?
Uh-huh.
And even, even after we've acquired many of the properties of a language, like our first language, we still may want to advance in our vocabulary knowledge, and we have the option of doing intentional study of vocabulary. I mean, we do it for tests. Sometimes it may not be the most exciting thing and so forth, but we can do it. And my answer would be going back to just really thinking about the inherent advantages and disadvantages of both options, right? So um, perhaps you don't need to study vocabulary lists or flashcards at all if you are given a situation where, like with first language, where 24/7 you're immersed in the language, you're constantly getting exposure to the language, and you have an opportunity to acquire incidentally in other ways, right?
Uh-huh.
Um, but there may be advantages if you want to move quicker in terms of controlling what you're exposed to, because ultimately what you're doing when you do flashcards and you use frequency lists to select your target words and map out a plan and so forth, is you're controlling the input to which you're exposed. And you're
Uh-huh.
saying, I want to be exposed to this input and study it in this way. Um, but there are limitations that come with that. One of them is automaticity. When we speak with each other like we're doing right now, automaticity really matters. I'm speaking a series of words that are coming out fluently and naturally that I've learned over many years, over a lot of time in context, right? And so I'm able to use that. It's also an unconscious behavior. So the extent to which flashcards can get you that is questionable. And so I do think a lot of incidental learning is helpful and needed. But I wouldn't say, no, no, no. If you're really motivated to study flashcards, and I think that it's good for things like getting word forms, having exposure to word forms, especially if you're exposed to spoken forms. A lot of the research I do has been on intentional vocabulary learning. For example, when you're learning word picture pairs, you see a picture and you learn the word, and you're exposed to a written form or you listen to the spoken form. Um, yes, I think that's good to learn the word forms and to map them to their basic meanings, or at least the meanings that we can assume based on your previous experience with L1. But in order to learn the L2 specific uses and meanings of those words, you're not going to get that from flashcard learning alone. You said in the product that you mentioned, you have sentences. Well, that's a step in the right direction.
Uh-huh.
At least it's going to give you some collocational properties of the words and so forth. But I would just suggest thinking of it in terms of advantages and disadvantages from a logical perspective. And I think you can spell it out for yourself. Can I ask you what your thoughts are on that in terms of the amount of intentional study with flashcards that you would, based on your experience, that you
Uh-huh.
think you would like to do as compared to vocabulary learning in context? And
Well, in terms of what I'd like to do, I'd like to do no intentional learning. I mean, I have to
okay,
say that the flashcards and so on, it's not so. It's not. I mean, it can get pretty dry and boring. But my experience has been that at least with Japanese, I've done this, and specifically with a frequency list, with the flashcards, it's been hugely useful. Not necessarily in gaining full mastery of each word, but at least I can get the learning started for each of these words. And when I encounter them in any kind of input, then I can say, okay, I sort of understand what this means. So I definitely think that it speeds up the learning process, but yeah, it's can definitely be
right.
boring.
And if I can say something to make it what I think is an important distinction about intentional study of vocabulary versus intentional study of grammar,
Uh-huh.
I think it might be relevant here. Like I said, when you do intentional study of vocabulary, you're selecting your input and you're selecting, whether it's just a picture or a translation, or you give yourself the word in context. However much you do that, you're controlling your own input. But the fact of the intentional study doesn't mean that you're doing something as qualitatively different as when you're learning grammar rules. When you
Right.
study, for example, you're trying to acquire an aspect of morphosyntax, for example, for Japanese or some other language, and you study that explicitly, the way in which that may not translate into fluent use of that grammatical structure is really different from what it means to study vocabulary intentionally. Because, like you said, I agree, you've got exposure to the word form, which is helpful, right? So then when you encounter the word in context, you will have been exposed to that word form. It won't be completely novel, and that can be useful to you. That's something really qualitatively different from intentional or explicit grammar instruction and study, right? And I
Right.
think that distinction is really important to make.
Right, and I just wanted to talk a little bit more about this because the flashcards that I made for multiple languages, I also made sure to include multiple, like a lot more information that apparently is useful, and this is based on the conversation I had with Paul. So specifically, each flashcard has a target word, an example sentence, audio as well, and very important to me, at least I've seen this, I mean, I've experienced the efficacy of this is I've included a mnemonic to go with each flashcards that uses the keyword technique to sort of improve learning. So I just wanted to get your opinion on this. I've seen good results, but what is your opinion on this?
Yes. Well, your conclusion about you wish you didn't have to do any intentional study at all, I agree with that. And I think, unless you want to for specific reasons. And I think if you do intentional study of isolated words, just be aware of the limitations,
Yep.
and it can't be a substitute for the rest. So we agree on that. And I just wanted to reiterate that before answering your next question about mnemonics, right? So, using a mnemonic device can be very powerful for recoding. What the keyword method does is recode the an L2 form or some type of novel form into a familiar form, and then make a connection that helps you to map it to a meaning that you can remember. And I think I'm not sure, but I think there was a paper by Ellis and Beaton from the I think the late 90s that I always remember this example of the keyword method for the German word Ecke, right? And the example they give in that paper is think of an echo in the corner, which is an odd association, right?
Uh-huh.
So, I think out forever, I will probably know that the word Ecke means corner in German, right? Even though I don't speak
Yep.
much more German. That is a powerful memory device. But that gets into another issue, which is when we're learning vocabulary, we're not only dealing with quantity of lexical items that we want to learn, quality is also another important issue, right? And so I always think that the keyword method can be useful if you're traveling and you have to remember some maybe long word or even short words that are challenging to remember in a second language, and you make use of the keyword to remember it, and it can be quite useful on that front. But if it's a language that you're seriously trying to acquire, maybe for some words it might be helpful to you to remember them. But I think an extended type of program of study
Uh-huh.
that involves keyword comes with some contraindications, let's just say, right?
Right.
Some potential drawbacks. And that, I think a lot of those have to do with quality. There is some research that indicates there are limits on how effective it is, but there are other studies that indicate that it's quite effective. Here I'm talking about the keyword method,
Yep.
right? That I just gave an example of. Um, but these associations that you're making can get confused in your developing bilingual mental lexicon, right? And so I guess you could ask yourself, well, how clean do I want my developing bilingual lexicon to be, right?
Uh-huh.
By creating these odd associations, and many times they're very odd when you use the keyword method. The mnemonic can be powerful, and the benefit of the mnemonic is the recoding of the L2 form into something familiar, like the L1 form, right?
Right.
That's where the benefit is coming. It's not coming from the semantic elaboration. It's not. It's the that key recode the recoding is critical. But there is research, and I've actually been involved in some research that indicates that the keywords that you use are retained in the mind and can slow down processing in certain types of ways. So just be aware of that. And I think, again, going back to, I think this is going to be a central message from me at least, is knowing what to expect from different options and knowing advantages and disadvantages to each one. So I would not advocate a full scale uh, program of study that is always with a lot of keywords. I think that
Right,
can
right.
lead to a lot of drawbacks. But for particularly difficult words here and there, certain words you can't remember. And again, I think it's useful on a limited basis if you're traveling and it's a language you're probably not going to acquire anyway, fully or very extensively. It can help you to remember certain phrases and certain words and so forth. So.
That's right. I should take this chance to apologize to some of my customers who've purchased the flashcard packages because the flashcard packages that I've developed have one mnemonic per flashcard, but I did not mention that you don't need to use the mnemonic, so it's just there if you need it, as well as all of the other information. But yeah, I think that for particularly hard words, it could be a good option, but you definitely don't need it for every single flashcard. I wanted to talk. Sorry, you wanted to say something?
Well, I just want to make another thing just on the positive side about providing people with mnemonics is with the keyword method, if that's what you're using in your cards.
Yep, that's right.
Another drawback of the keyword method for learners that have to come up with them on their own, they're not always easy to come up with. So the fact that you've provided them, at least, if it is a word that on the formal front is, which I have many in Japanese, for example, that on the formal front is challenging to you, the fact that someone's provided the keyword is a real plus because it's not always easy to come up with them.
Yeah, it takes a long time. And also, I forgot to mention, but there is mnemonic plus there is for some words a what I think is called the word part analysis. So if you have a long word, then you break it down into its components and sort of explain what they mean. So some words also have this. But you mentioned something about how learning vocabulary shouldn't necessarily be all about volume. It should be also about quality. I just want to link this to the next question, which is how should we be thinking of goals in terms of learning vocabulary? Because to be honest, up until now, for me, it's always been about the numbers. Like, okay, I do 5 flashcards today, and that's it. It's all about the numbers.
Yeah. So I think, the numbers are good, but I think, and, if you're learning basic word forms and their basic meanings, it's over time, you're going to develop the language specific knowledge for that, right? So there are idiomatic expressions in English that I have yet to learn, and I look forward to learning them, right? And once I learn new idiomatic expressions, I'll know that certain words X, Y, and Z go in those idiomatic expressions, right? So in your native language as well, you still have opportunities to continue to learn um, how words are used in context, the qualitative, you're developing qualitatively for these different words over time, right? For vocabulary over time. In the L2, it's even more of a challenge because you don't start from scratch, right? So, as you can imagine, when we're exposed to new word forms in any L2, we don't immediately unlearn the meaning of those that we have associated with the L1 translation of those words, right? And we can talk more about the bilingual mental lexicon if you'd like, and so forth, and how that develops over time. But I think it's something that with your first language, when you're learning vocabulary, it happens naturally over time, right? At least to the extent to which we think we know words, right? And we qualitatively, I would say, okay, well, I know the word for chair, right? but I certainly probably don't know all of the idiomatic expressions in English that chair can occur in. And that's part of the knowledge of the word chair at the end of the day, right? Um, and so even in L1, we need to develop on that front. But I think it's more uh, the demand when you're learning in L2 on that front is even more apparent, right? Because all words have their L2 specific uses and meanings. So I'm sure, and the connotations that certain words should provoke or make us think of, right, when we're exposed
Yeah.
to them. So sure, with Japanese, well, certain words, this word has X connotation, whereas in English it doesn't have that connotation at all, right, on that front. So all of that qualitative information, and that's just about meanings, also about uses, how words can be used syntactically, that differ from one language to another. That's important as well. So uses, meanings, connotations, the collocational properties of words. That's also critical in L2 because we see things. I don't know if I can think of a good example offhand, but for example, I think the example that's given a lot, for example, I gave you the example of infant blue is not a way that you can describe blue, right? You also, another one that's also used a lot of times is powerful tea. We never say powerful tea, we say strong tea, right?
Right.
But that may not be the case in another language, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure you could think of some examples given time with the difference between English and Japanese or English and any other language. And so, whereas with L1 acquisition, you kind of acquire those naturally over time. When you come to an L2, you have these already existing in your mental lexicon, and we may make assumptions about how those words can be used, but they're incorrect. And that again needs to come from the type of input that involves at least sentence level and discourse level input of some sort, and not only isolated words in the input.
So then is the consensus that as a child you're acquiring your L1 in a way that is pretty natural, but then with your L2 as an adult, is the fact that you've learned another language previously, your L1, is this hindering the learning process for the L2?
I wouldn't use the term hindering necessarily. I would use the term that it's an issue that needs to be dealt with, that it's a reality that we need to deal with, that we may make assumptions because it's a good strategy to make an assumption. So let me give you one example that I give a lot. So let's take the word apple, right? Do you know how to say apple in Spanish, right? By chance?
Actually, I don't know. I studied Spanish for
Good,
5 years, but it
good.
was a disaster. Yeah.
That's okay. Well, in Peninsular Spanish from the peninsula, uh, apple is manzana. Okay, so manzana.
Well,
In
okay.
Latin American Spanish, it would be manzana, right? But I want to actually focus on Peninsular Spanish because in Peninsular Spanish, so you would learn now. You know the word for Peninsular Spanish, apple, right? So what is that? I just
Manzana.
manzana, right? Yeah, manzana,
Manzana.
right?
Yeah.
So you would make assumptions about how that can be used, right?
Right.
Would you ever think, for example, that you could say in Peninsular Spanish, I live 3 apples from your house. I live 3 manzanas from your house.
Probably not.
No. You
Yeah.
wouldn't know that until you were exposed to that in some type of communicative context where you were exposed to that, right?
Right.
And there's no way you could get that from just, having a picture of an apple and learning that. And so,
Yeah.
and it would be a good strategy to assume that you cannot do that, right? And there'd be no reason to assume that you could until you're exposed to that information in the input. So with L2, we make assumptions about the way things can and can't be used, right? Um, sometimes when it comes to word forms, I think another common example of that is when we have splits, when you have one word form that has two meanings in the other language, right? So, for example, with Spanish, we have the verbs cambiar, which in English can mean to cash or to change, right?
Right.
And I had a friend, this is an example I like to use, who hadn't learned that distinction between to cash and to change, which he needed to learn in English, but it doesn't exist in Spanish. And he went to the bank after moving and being immersed here in St. Louis and asked, he said, I would like to change my checks. And uh, they took out, a picture of all the different checks he could select from. But what he was trying to say was cash, right?
Right.
So he was, I want to cash my check. And they tried to give him so he could change his check style. So there's an example with the word cambiar in Spanish. You have to learn that it's both to change and to cash in English. And when you're going from English to Spanish, you have to do kind of the opposite. You have to combine the
Right.
two. And so there's all kinds of different L2 specific meanings, uses, and collocational properties that we have to learn when we're exposed to a new L2, right? For vocabulary in L2.
Yeah, and just want to say a little bit more on this. I've noticed, at least it's been my observation, being a French speaker, that between, let's say, French and English, which are fairly close languages, I suppose, just like Spanish, there are these issues of, the different nuances of words that we may consider to be exact translations sometimes. But it seems to me that for languages that are pretty far from English, like Japanese, for example, this gap in nuances and use, it gets even bigger. So I don't have any examples here on top of my head, but it's a big problem. I want to talk about effective methods that people can use to learn language. I've talked a lot about flashcards, but obviously people need to use other methods as well, considering all the collocations and so on, and expressions that they need to use. What do you think are some effective methods for adults to acquire vocabulary in a new language?
Okay, great. Well, at this point, I'd like to kind of jump a little bit to some research foundations.
Hmm.
Um, my research focuses on input processing. So when we're exposed to a second language as input, as a sample of that particular language in some type of communicative context, how we process the input to which we're exposed. And instead of focusing on some other level of input processing, I focus in particular on lexical input processing, which is how learners acquire individual words and other types of lexical items, right? Which I've mentioned, lexical phrases and so forth, when they're exposed to those items as input, right?
Right.
So, and that is a necessary ingredient of vocabulary learning. You have to be exposed to it in the input, or nothing happens, right? Sugas said that about input. Without it, nothing happens, right?
Right.
Both in terms of vocabulary and other aspects of language, of second languages. Um, so when we're exposed to new words in the input, again, either an intentional context or an incidental context, um, two big types of manipulations that we can do as instructors or also as learners, or as in your case, producers of instructional materials, um, is to, one would be to manipulate the way in which the input is presented, right? Which I would call input-based manipulations or input-based effects, right? Where we find effects, those would be input-based effects. And another way we can do it is by altering or manipulating the type of task that learners engage in when they're exposed to those items, right? So starting with input-based manipulations, I think one of the most common ones we know is increased repetition, right? So
Right.
increasing the frequency in either spoken input or written input, or if it's a sign language, the visual input that you're exposed to. Increasing frequency is going to be useful. There's a lot of research on, well, not a lot of research, actually. There's more research on retrieval in this area, but um, there's different, well, we'll talk more about that in a minute, but that's one thing that you can do. Another thing that you can do is you can enhance the input in ways that have been found to be effective. And for example, one And I would advocate looking at all of the research on different ways of presenting input, presenting target vocabulary as input, seeing what's been found to be effective, and then you going with those in terms of ways that you can present the input, right?
Uh-huh.
So one area that we've been working on since about, well, actually since about 2000 even, is in spoken input, when this is what I would call one type of enhancement. By enhancement, I mean you can do things like bolding words, underlining words. There's research in written, with incidental vocabulary learning, using written input. Things like marginal glosses are helpful. Holstein and colleagues did research on that. And the benefits of increased repetition have been found both for incidental and intentional learning as well. So, but when I say enhancement, I mean, what can we do with words to make them more, I wouldn't say more learnable, but more likely to be learned, right?
Uh-huh.
And this is maybe more about quantity than quality from our previous discussion, right? The number of words that they can use. So Mitch Summers and I started doing some research back before 2005 on presenting target words in the input, either with when they're spoken by one talker, for example, or they're spoken by three talkers, or they're spoken by six talkers. And this is research on the amount of acoustic variability that we use when we present target words in the input. And what we found in one of our first studies was that you go from something around 38. If you have one talker, let's say this is an intentional vocabulary learning study, right? With pictures, and you're seeing pictures and you're hearing Spanish words. This was a study with Spanish, L2 Spanish, with absolute beginners. If you're seeing pictures and you're hearing the words, if all six words are produced by one speaker, the one recording of one speaker, your learning is at about 38%. Okay.
Uh-huh.
If you have three speakers with two repetitions each, so it's either one speaker, six repetitions, three speakers, two repetitions each, you go significantly higher. Your learning gets significantly higher. You're more accurate and you're faster. And then if you have six different talkers with one repetition each, it gets even higher. So it's a graded beneficial effect of increasing the numbers of talkers that you use to present target words in the spoken input, right? And when you go from no variability, which is one speaker, you're around 38%, all the way up to six speakers, it goes up to something like 64%, right?
Right.
So this is a major increase without doing anything different, right? So
Yep.
this is something, and why this isn't in all instructional materials yet, I'm not sure. That's another issue we could talk about. It ought to be, in my opinion, right?
Yep.
So this is just one example of a way of presenting target words in the input that is helpful, right? So increasing the number of talkers that you use to produce that who produce the target words that learners are exposed to. But that research on acoustic variability, interestingly, extends to other ways that you can vary the degree of acoustic variability in the input. So we did another study with an individual speaker, and we looked at different voice types or different speaking styles, like whispered, excited voice, childlike voice, denasalized voice, etc., right? Elongated voice. And in that study, we found a similar pattern of a graded benefit, a benefit of acoustic variability, in this case, speaking style or voice type variability, where you go up. And in these studies, we had on the post test, the learners had to both produce the target words when they were exposed to pictures, right? And then they also they were told produce the words as accurately and as quickly as you can. So they not only did they get more accurate, they were faster in producing them, which tends to always go together. But there's an interesting pattern in that larger body of research, and just let me quickly summarize it for you, and then I'll go on to others. In that research, you find benefits for talker variability, for speaking style variability, for speaking rate variability when produced by one speaker, You do not find it for amplitude variability, interesting, varying the amplitude. And you only find it for fundamental frequency variability, a type of tone variability manipulation, if the learners already speak a tone language. So that's interesting. Oh. And then most recently, research by Frida Fichtner and colleagues, and I've been involved in these studies as well, looked at L2 German vocabulary learning and found that dialect variability or regional variety variability of the sociophonetic type also produces positive effects even beyond those of talker variability. So that's one way of manipulating the input, right? There may be other ways of enhancing, increasing the repetition. When you present target words in the input, making sure learners have access to the meaning of the target words one way or the other. A picture is very clear, a translation is clear, but the extent to which you want to promote relying on translations is that's another issue. For incidental learning in the context of sentences, it's not always clear, and there's a lot of L2 vocabulary research that is focused on that, the extent to which L2 learners can pick up new words or not from the context of different types of context when reading and so forth. So I could go a little bit further on the input-based effects side, but I'll jump to the task-based effects side, right? Which is, this is what can we have learners do when they are exposed to target words or, a series of target words that's going to be useful. And I think the first thing, I'll start on the positive side here. And the first thing I would say is after learners have had at least one exposure to target words in an intentional learning paradigm, if you allow them opportunities to attempt to retrieve the target words on their own before exposing them again to the target words, that can be beneficial for both intentional and incidental vocabulary learning. It has a positive effect. So the task that's useful there is allowing them to retrieve, right? And I want to make an important distinction here because this I would call a type of output with access to meaning, because they've been exposed to the target words. They're seeing a picture. They're trying to retrieve the target words when they're shown a picture, for example, right? It's a type of output without access to meaning. Lee and Van Patten, in their book, Making Communicative Language Teaching Happen, back in the early 2000s, actually made this distinction in general terms for language learning. And I've made it for vocabulary learning. What it doesn't mean what it's not the same as is output without access to meaning. So if I expose you to a series of words in an L2 and I just say copy them immediately, that's not really retrieval, and that's a type of output without access to meaning. Or choral repetition, which is done in classrooms a lot of times. We're going to learn these Japanese words, just repeat them after me. But it's a type of a parroting, right, which doesn't involve real retrieval. I won't go through all the research, but I can tell you that most of the research that's been done to date on that indicates that there's either no effect or negative effects of that. So that distinction between output with access to meaning versus without access to meaning is really important. And then I'll just give one more example, sort of in general terms, on the task-based side. So these are task-based manipulations that you can do when learners are exposed to words. A lot of my research, which is put to test a model that I proposed back in the early 2000s called the TOPR model, the type of processing resource allocation model, which argues that it's important to distinguish between dissociably different types of processing and the types of learning that you can expect from them, distinguishing between the semantic versus the form-oriented versus mapping-oriented components of vocabulary learning. We used to think a task like just writing target words in sentences, for example, would be a really useful task. And when I first started doing my research back in the late 90s, I was really interested in levels of processing theory and how, writing target words in sentences could be helpful, potentially helpful, right? but my early research indicated it actually wasn't. And not only that, you can get really strong negative effects from
Right.
having learners write words in novel sentences that they have to develop on their own. But not only that type of semantically elaborative tasks, but other types of tasks like pleasantness ratings tasks, thinking about word meaning. If you're elaborating on word meaning, just be aware that that's not helping you learn the word form, right? Which in this case, we can talk about flashcards a little bit as maybe being, hey, well, they're not having that. If they're not having that, that may be an advantage we can talk about there by simply avoiding that. But those kind of tasks don't seem to be helpful. In other words, they seem to be getting in the learner's way by forcing them in the case of sentence writing, the type of semantic elaboration you do when you do that task is necessarily going to be redundant because you're going to rely on your L1 knowledge about the word's meaning as opposed to your L2 knowledge, right? So be aware of the limits of those types of tasks. So there are many more I could go through, different types of different ways of manipulating input-based effects, and different ways of manipulating task-based effects. But I'll stop there for now because I just don't want to go on and on.
Yeah, no, this is actually fascinating because, I mean, especially the thing you said in the beginning about the having multiple talkers. So I suppose, obviously, in this case, we're talking about listening input, and it's so funny because I was talking about this exact same thing approximately with Dr. Ron Thompson in another interview, but we're talking about pronunciation, how people tend to acquire at least better perceptive pronunciation with multiple talkers. I think the core difference here is that for pronunciation to get better, it really has to be the same dialect, so American English or British English and so on. But I'm not sure that the listeners actually realize how big this is. So if I put this in simple terms, you can listen to something just once, like most people do with the same person, or you can listen to it with multiple talkers, and your vocabulary learning is going to increase dramatically just by having different talkers repeating the same thing.
Yeah, the dramatic part, yes, I completely agree with. It's not just once for the single talker condition, though. The
Yep.
only thing that changes, because that would be a confound, right? If I said, okay, well, we have one talker just saying it once, repeating a word once. That's not what I'm saying. One
Oh, okay.
talker
Right, right.
repeating it 6 times, right? 3 talkers repeating it 2 times, or 6 talkers repeating it once each, right?
Right.
And the talkers repeating it once each is drastically produces drastically more lexical learning than the than
Yep.
the than the single talker with the same number of repetitions, right? I think that's really important because we don't want to introduce time
Right, right.
confounds or number of repetition
It,
confounds. But
yeah,
but yeah,
otherwise,
I
yeah.
absolutely agree with you on the dramatic front. And so hopefully this interview will be helpful for some producers of instructional materials to to incorporate this in instructional materials, because nowadays, I mean, I can't say the same for graphemic variability. As a matter of fact, this will clarify something if people are saying, hey, well, this happened if you vary the way you write words too. And actually, just recently at a conference, some colleagues, Mitch Summers and Johnny Yeldham and myself, we presented a poster at the bilingual conference in Chicago, the bilingualism conference, about graphemic variability, because the logical next step, you would say, hello, Kitty. The logical next step would be to say, well, does this work with written input as well, right? And
Right.
the short answer is, based on our research so far, is no. So there you go, right? Just like it doesn't work with amplitude variability. There's an interesting story about the different sources of acoustic variability, because there's another area of research on L1 speech processing that has looked at these same sources of acoustic variability, and there's an interesting pattern. I mean, if anyone wants a reference, I'm happy to give it on that front. But I think that would be getting maybe too much into the weeds. But
Right.
since we're focusing on second language vocabulary learning, but no, that would be a big one that I would like. That would be a take home point that really should, I think, be incorporated more and more. My in 2012, I published a book called Input Based Incremental Vocabulary Learning or Instruction, which advocates an IBI approach. And it has 10 principles. One of the principles is to present target words in an enhanced manner, right? There are many types of enhanced manners that have been demonstrated to work. Another one is using background classical music. There's another one. Whether you know theoretically why that happens or not may not matter if you're just interested in incorporating it in your instruction. But this one about the different sources of acoustic variability, I think is so useful that I think it's in the second edition of my book. I think I'm gonna have it be its own principle. So we'll have 12 principles instead of 10. I think I'm adding
Oh,
two where we see that research is pointing to that as something. Hey, please incorporate this. So that would be
yeah.
a take home point. And again, so it's talker variability, speaking style variability, speaking rate variability, um, fundamental frequency variability. If your learners already speak a tone language, right? Like in the study we did was with Zapotec, um, and sociophonetic regional variability in with the L2 German study that we've done.
Right. You mentioned classical music. What do you mean? So, could you talk a little bit more about that?
I think that was a study done by De Groot that looked at classical music in the background. I think it was without lyrics. I think it's always important to be careful about how much it wasn't heavy metal music with lots of lyrics. It wasn't
Yeah.
that. It was just background classical music. And I think I'd have to look to see how much more research has been done on that since it's been published. But that was always a curious one to me. There was a study that was it was in the context of a larger study done by De Groot that had a study that found that effect, that when the background classical music was played without lyrics, that the vocabulary learning was higher, um, significantly.
Really? Wow. Just like in the background when you're reading something or listening to something.
I believe, again, here I'd have to go back and look at the study. It's been a while, but I think that it was intentional vocabulary learning in that
Okay.
study.
Okay.
Um, yeah. With, so I've told you a couple of ways of presenting. The one that I mentioned about the benefits of retrieval, right? A type of output with access to meaning, that's been demonstrated both for intentional vocabulary learning and for incidental vocabulary learning. So just to let you know that. So if
Right.
while you're doing incidental vocabulary learning, if words reappear and you have an opportunity to try to retrieve them on your own before you're exposed to them in whatever, that seems to be useful. And also with the benefits of retrieval, there's a lot of research on the different types of expanding retrieval and so forth. Some patterns of retrieval opportunities tend to be better than others when it comes to quantity of vocabulary learning
Right.
as well.
Oh, this is fascinating. I mean, there's so much information here that I can implement in my. I'm a software developer, so I'm trying to develop language learning software. So I'll need to go over this video again and list exact principles and try to make something out of them. All right. So,
Great.
Joe, I want to be respectful of your time. This has been really great, very informative. Is there anything else that you want to talk about that we didn't mention?
Well, I saw one of the earlier questions that you had asked about if I were learning a new language, what I would want. I think you
Right.
meant, I'd like to answer that because,
Yes.
and if anyone out, and Japanese is actually a language that I was in Japan this semester. I have wonderful colleagues. There's a lot of folks working on vocabulary, using a lot of great methodological tools and innovative tools, looking at L2 vocabulary learning with fMRI and so forth. And when I was there and I was just enjoying being there so much, I was like, you should really learn Japanese or a certain level of Japanese, I said to myself, right? And so your question was, if you were learning a new language, what would you want? Well, this is something that I've said to graduate students who are instructors. I think if I had to say in one sentence what I would want is I would want someone who would provide me with lots of sufficiently comprehensible, meaning-bearing input
Right.
and give me in engaging ways to communicate in the language for different reasons, right? To communicate, to complete tasks, to learn new content, and so forth. But the one sentence I would say is provide me with lots of sufficiently comprehensible, meaning-bearing input, right? So the sufficiently comprehensible goes back to Krashen's recommendations and so forth. But if you really sit back and think about, well, what would that mean for me as a beginning Japanese learner, right? It would mean something different than it would mean for you as a much more advanced Japanese learner. And that's not easy to do, but that would be the one thing. So when I saw that question in the list of different questions, I thought that I'd like to answer that. So.
Right. So getting a tutor or maybe a language partner to create some input that is relevant and interesting in your own case is good
Yeah,
advice.
because the real challenge to that is when you stop to think what that means, right? What that means for a beginning learner, because I would want it all to be in Japanese. I
Yep.
wouldn't want to be doing translation, and I would want some nice mix of sentence level Japanese, but also sentence level input in Japanese, but also, isolated lexical items here and there is not a
Yep.
problem and it has its own advantages. So.
Good. Well, Joe, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much.